We're taking you live back now to Amman, Jordan, where the Jordanian foreign minister is speaking. He's holding a press conference also with the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. Let's listen in to both of them.
Palestinians now are at ICP level 5. That means over 1 million Palestinians are facing famine. Supplies have not been allowed into major parts of Gaza, including the north. So basically what we have is that Palestinians are killed by Israeli bullets, and we're having Palestinians dying from starvation, from dehydration. This has gone on for way too far. Israel has violated every humanitarian law, every moral principle, every humanitarian value, and unfortunately the world is still unable to say enough and say stop. Today the Security Council will be voting on a resolution demanding a ceasefire, demanding the entry of supplies. We urge all members of the Security Council to support that resolution, if only to send a message that what's happening is unacceptable and what's happening has to stop. Obviously, Israel has ignored UN Security Council resolutions before. There are no indications that it will honor this one, but I think what adopting the resolution would do today is just to send a message that Israel cannot continue to, with this aggression, with impunity, in complete disregard to international law, in complete disregard to human values, and in complete disregard to life. Sir, you said it aptly. Not too long ago, Gaza has become an open graveyard, not just for children, but for international law. And the consequences for that are extremely devastating, not just to the region, but to the whole principles of peace and order that your organization stands for. We thank you for your strong voice. We thank you for the positions that you've taken, demanding respect for international law, demanding respect for the UN Charter, and urging an immediate end to war crimes and to the killing and starving of the innocent. And we will continue to work with you, sir, to make sure that we end this madness, and we're going to continue to work with our international partners to make sure that the world stands united in saying enough is enough. Enough killing, enough war crimes, enough massacring of innocent, and enough impunity for violating international law and humanitarian law as well. The UN and Jordan have been solid partners for decades. Not only do we work together on the Palestinian issue, but we also work together on addressing the needs of refugees. Obviously, UNRWA is here, and I recognize the Commissioner General, him and his organization have been doing a tremendous job in trying to ease the suffering of the Palestinian people at those times that are, again, trying our whole humanity. So just want to say that UNRWA is indispensable, it is irreplaceable, and we're happy to see that many countries are coming back now to helping UNRWA save lives, because every dollar that is given to UNRWA is saving a human life, and every dollar taken away from UNRWA carries the risk of having a child suffer and die from the lack of food and medicine. So we stand together in supporting the agency and in urging all our partners to continue to provide UNRWA with the support that it so deserves, so that it can, again, do the basic job of just simply saving lives. Also, we've been working together on many other facets of cooperation, particularly in relation to the Syrian refugees. And while we are grateful for the support the UN and the international community has been given to help us in our effort to provide Syrian refugees with dignified lives and meet their needs and make sure that they're not victimized again. They've been victims of conflict. We cannot victimize them by having them ignored by the international community. But I have to say that we must ring the alarm and ring it loud about the dwindling support that's coming to refugees. Many UN agencies are cutting down their services in Jordan simply because not enough aid is coming. That means the burden will shift to us, and we simply cannot carry that burden alone. So again, we urge that our partners continue to show the responsibility towards Syrian refugees who do deserve a life of dignity and fulfillment until conditions are conducive for them to voluntarily go back to their country, which is the only realistic answer to their plight. So on all those issues, sir, we're going to continue to work as partners. We have immediate priorities right now in which we are aligned, end the aggression, allow sufficient humanitarian supplies in, and obviously prevent what would be another massacre in Rafah. The whole world is saying going into Rafah will lead to a humanitarian massacre. The Israeli government is not listening. They're still reaffirming that they will go into Rafah, and I would just conclude by saying that we cannot allow a group of radicals, racist, extremist ministers to doom the future of the region to more conflict and more war, and more immediately, we cannot allow them to continue to kill with impunity. Thank you, sir. I welcome you in Jordan, and I look forward to further engagement.
Assalamu alaikum. Dear Foreign Minister Safadi, dear friend, thank you for your warm welcome. And it's good to be back in Jordan, especially at such a critical time for the region and for the world. When I see Jordan, I see solidarity in action. And I see in the words and deeds of His Majesty King Abdullah a global champion for peace. And I see it in the spirit of the people of Jordan and your enormous compassion towards those fleeing upheaval. Jordan is home to the largest number of Palestinian refugees. I visited the camp earlier today and commend Jordan for your pivotal advocacy for the vital work of UNRWA. You have also opened your hearts and doors to many others, including refugees from Syria. And I urge the international community to support Jordan as it supports millions of people in need. It is very worrying, the reduction of funding in relation to refugee programs in Jordan and in other parts of the world. Jordan's spirit of solidarity is precisely what brings me here once again. I am on my annual solidarity mission during the holy months of Ramadan, where I visit and fast with Muslim communities in distress. Ramadan is meant to be a period of celebration, but not this year. Hearts are heavy in the region and indeed around the world from the unprecedented and ongoing devastation in Gaza, as well as rising violence in the occupied West Bank. I commend Jordan for your support for de-escalation, including particularly your very important role in East Jerusalem. And I salute Jordan for your relentless effort to get humanitarian assistance into Gaza, including through the personal efforts and wisdom of His Majesty. For my part, I will keep pushing for the removal of all obstacles to life-saving aid, for more access and for more entry points. But we must face facts. There will be no sustainable humanitarian solution with an ongoing war as bloody as this. Let me repeat, nothing justifies the abhorrent October 7 attacks and hostage-taking by Hamas, and nothing justifies the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. The effective delivery of humanitarian aid requires the immediate delivery of a humanitarian ceasefire. The need is urgent. I was at the Rafah border crossing this weekend, and I met with injured Palestinian civilians and heard directly from our frontline humanitarian colleagues. They are veterans of some of the worst humanitarian crises in recent decades. They have seen it all. And yet, without exception, they told me they had never seen anything as horrible as what is happening in Gaza today. The scale and speed of the deaths and destruction are on an entirely different level. And now starvation is bearing down on Palestinians in Gaza. There is a growing consciousness around the world that all of these must stop. The fighting must end now. The hostages must be released now, and we must not lose sight of the big picture. A lasting end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only come through a two-state solution. Israelis must see their legitimate needs for security materialized, and Palestinians must see their legitimate aspirations for a fully independent, viable, and sovereign state realized in line with United Nations resolutions, international law, and previous agreements. We know where the alternative would lead to indefinitely prolonging a conflict that has become a major threat to global peace and security, to exacerbating polarization, to emboldening extremists everywhere. Those standing in the way of a two-state solution have an obligation to state clearly what is the alternative they want. How would the future look with such a large number of Palestinians inside without any real sense of freedom, of rights, and of dignity? This would be inconceivable. The two-state solution is the only way to address the legitimate aspirations of both Israelis and Palestinians. I know it is easy to be cynical in today's world, but that's a luxury we cannot afford. Cynicism is a form of surrender to the prevailing assumptions of the moment. It is a refuge for those too weak, too narrow, too timid to imagine a better future. When things are difficult, we must try even harder. And I will keep pushing for peace inspired by your example. And once again, dear Foreign Minister, dear friends, thank you and thank the government and people of Jordan for leading the way to solidarity and peace.
Thank you, sir. Take some questions, Fiona.
زيد خليفات قناة المملكة بخصوص ما يحدث في شمال غزة.
With respect to what is currently taking place in the north of Gaza Strip.
The volume is not enough. No, it's the volume. That's it. It's my.
تمام.
I have to take this out to be able to listening to you. Yes, I can hear you now.
ما يحدث في شمال غزة.
What is currently taking place in the north of Gaza Strip, totally denied of relief aid, simultaneously with Israel's statement that they will attack Rafah. How you, together with the international partners, working towards lessening the plight of the Palestinians who are teetering on the verge of famine?
First of all, in relation to the northern part of Gaza, it is absolutely essential to have a massive supply of humanitarian aid now. And this means opening more entry points. This means a concentration of efforts of all entities without obstacles, without limitations from the Israeli side in order to be able to rescue the people of northern Gaza of an imminent risk of famine. Many children are already today dying of hunger. Finally, in relation to the south, to Rafah, our position has been very clear. We consider that a ground offensive against Rafah could lead to a catastrophic humanitarian situation.
To add, Gaza is already reeling under famine. The north part of Gaza is in a dire situation as the Israeli occupation forces are using delivery aid as weapon. All this can come to an end if the Israeli belligerence comes to an end and delivery of aid can be allowed through more border crossing. Famine is a direct cause of Israeli policy of denial of relief aid into Gaza Strip. We are prepared to provide all what is needed by the Gaza population. The relief aid is already present. The mechanisms are in place. What is missing is to eliminate Israelis' policy of total denial of delivery of relief aid into Gaza. A question to the Secretary General. Israel prevented UNRWA from delivering relief aid into the north of Gaza Strip. They are also accusing UNRWA to be collaborating with the Palestinian resistance. Is there a clear position by the international community to respond to Israel's claims and also to put an end to the situation in the north? The second question to the Jordanian foreign minister. It is clear that Israel is simply buying time, refusing a ceasefire. On the other hand, you are still calling for a ceasefire. How do your calls resonate? Where is the response to the entire Arab diplomacy? And how can we make these calls effective and taking place in reality?
The decision not to allow UNRWA's convoys to go. The decision not to allow UNRWA's convoys to go to northern Gaza, where we have a dramatic starvation situation, is totally unacceptable. And those that took that decision must assume the responsibility, facing history, of the consequences of the decision in relation to the dramatic situation of the people in northern Gaza, where, as I mentioned, we have already children dying of hunger.
The position of Jordan is not only to outcry calls, but they were doing our best since day one to bring this war to an end, and our efforts have not come to a halt. Let's be realistic. Jordan alone cannot bring this war to an end at a time where Israel is defying the entire world, violating the international law, continuing with their belligerence. However, we started to see more outcries from the international community. The international community's position has been shifting towards Israel's killing policy of starvation. We are dealing with reality where Israel is defying and violating the international law. They are even going against their historical ally, the United States. Today, as I reiterated earlier, there is a draft resolution before the Security Council calling for a ceasefire and swift delivery of relief aid. We are urging all the member states to adopt this draft resolution, even to take a moral and legal and ethical stand, stating that the policy of killing, starvation is unacceptable and undermine the international community, the international law, and the international organization. At the end of the day, Israel is doing what they are doing, perpetrating their crimes simply because they are not deterred. There is nothing to deter Israel. We have gone beyond that. The Israeli government is led by radical racist ministers. We cannot allow them to continue to drown the entire region into further chaos. Rather than sending arms to Israel, diplomacy must work. Delegations must visit Israel to direct the current Israeli government, and the current government must be held liable for their crimes. The crisis and the tragedy of Gaza and Gazans are exacerbating the entire international community is losing credibility before the dual standards and Israel's continued violations of the international system. God knows that since day one, Jordan has been doing all they can. The Palestinian cause will remain our focal issue. The Palestinian people, the safeguarding of their rights, their interest, and their right to life will be our paramount priority. We, including the international community, are faced with Israeli government, the most radical in its history, turning a blind eye not only to the international law, but all the human and ethical values, continuing to kill, starve Gaza and Gazans. And we are doing all what we can with our regional and international partners, including the United Nations, and all those willing to take a clear stand against the Israeli occupation for the sake of humanity, dignity, and the right of the Palestinian people. And even further, the position of Jordan has been clear, doing all what we can to bring this conflict to an end. And the only means is by ending the occupation and enabling the Palestinians to have their independent sovereign state established on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem at its capital. Let this war come to an end, and even if it ends, more wars would be waged simply because this position, this situation cannot continue, where the horizons of hope, freedom before 5 Palestinians and more are undermined.
Maria Wild Ali, The Jordan Times. After more than 5 months of brutal violence and collective punishments that inflicted upon Palestinians by Israeli occupation forces, today the Security Council is held hostage by a couple of members who stand behind empty arguments at the expense of Palestinian lives, thereby the Council failing to assume its responsibilities and maintain international peace and security. The question is, how will the UN remedy the diminished credibility of its own promises? And what are the new challenges to conflict resolution that this war presented? Finally, what are the mechanisms to pressure Israel at this point to allow full aid into Gaza, taking into consideration that denying aid contradicts ICJ's ruling, which ordered immediate measures to protect Palestinians in Gaza from the risk of genocide by ensuring sufficient humanitarian assistance? Thank you.
I think it's necessary to recognize that the United Nations is a complex organization. In the United Nations, you have humanitarian agencies that are today working in Gaza with an extreme courage. We have already 171 workers, staff members of UNRWA that were killed in Gaza. And they are United Nations. So you have in the United Nations extraordinary examples of courage and generosity and solidarity with people suffering. The United Nations is also the General Assembly that has assumed clear positions in relation to this conflict. The United Nations is the Secretary General that has been assuming, on behalf of the Secretariat, clear positions in relation to this conflict. And the United Nations is also the Security Council. And indeed, the Security Council today is victim of the enormous geopolitical divides in the world, with the superpowers at odds with each other, and creating a situation in which it's very difficult to find consensus in relation to any of the difficult crises we are facing in the world, not only in relation to Gaza. And that is why it is so important that finally the Security Council became able to approve a resolution asking for a ceasefire in Gaza. But at the same time, it is our duty to do everything to mobilize the whole of the international community. And I see a consensus emerging in the international community, even in the countries that are friends and allies of Israel. I see a consensus emerging that this war must stop. I see a consensus emerging that any ground offensive against Rafah would lead to a catastrophic humanitarian situation. I see a consensus emerging in the international community to tell Israel that fully recognizing the grievances caused by the horrific attacks of Hamas in the 7th of October, fully recognizing the drama of the hostages that need to be immediately and unconditionally released, fully recognizing those aspects, nothing can justify this collective punishment of the Palestinian people that is causing such an immense tragedy in Gaza.
Shukran. Sir, thank you very much.
You've just been listening to a joint press conference by the Jordanian Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi and the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. A few of the headlines from that conference, and both the Minister and the Secretary General were taking questions at the end. So some of the headlines here. First, from the Jordanian Foreign Minister, he said, Israel has violated every moral principle, that Gaza is now an open graveyard, that Israel's government is led by radical and racist ministers who are dragging the region into chaos, and he called on the UN Security Council to adopt the draft that is going to be put before the Council later today, if only, he said, if only to signal to the world that enough is enough. So that's on the part of the Jordanian Foreign Minister. Now, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has said that speaking with his teams in Gaza, they've never seen anything as bad as Gaza. And he was pointing out this is coming from seasoned humanitarian veterans. He also said the scale and the speed of the death and destruction in Gaza is on an entirely different level. Let's bring in Adel Abdel Ghaffar. He's a fellow and director for the Foreign Policy and Security Program at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. You were listening to the whole thing with us. What stood out to you?
Well, I'm struck by the Secretary General's comments. I have to say they're very courageous, open, and critical of Israel. But at the same time, he highlighted in his comments the limitations of the UN as an organization and the inability of the UN Security Council to find a binding resolution against Israel. So you find that him really highlighting the work of the UN, but at the same time highlighting its limitations.
So that's really interesting. That's what he ended with, and that's also what stood out to me. He was asked a question about how international condemnation of Israel's war can actually be implemented into facts and into a ceasefire. And he gave this rather long answer, but I think we should get into it because it's interesting. He said, look, the UN is a complex place. It's a vast place. And if I paraphrase, he was essentially saying the one thing that's not working, the one thing where we're stuck is the Security Council. But everything else, there is clarity, whether it's the General Assembly, which has passed a resolution back in, it was a few months ago now, it passed a resolution calling for a ceasefire. Whether it's the General Assembly, whether it's the Secretary General himself, whether it's the people, the UN staff working on the ground, many of whom have been killed, he says all of that's working. The one thing that's not working, where we're not finding consensus on major world issues, including Israel, is the Security Council.
That's correct, and this is a reflection, of course, of the geopolitical issues, ramifications of the Russia-Ukraine war, the fragmentation of global order, the rising US-China competition, by which the UN Security Council now is an arena of all of these issues. So it becomes less about Gaza and Palestine and more about the geopolitical context. But actually, if you look at the resolution from last week and you look at the resolution that they are voting on today, if the US actually joins in unanimously voting for this actual ceasefire, then this will actually become further pressure on Israel to act. But I don't see that happening.
Yeah, you told us earlier they won't.
I don't think so, because since the UN was established, the US has vetoed more than 40 resolutions that have condemned Israel, actually 46. And what we'll see today is probably the 47th of them, as the US provides the fig leaf for Israel to cover its crimes. And if this fig leaf is removed, then really Israel will be exposed for the genocide that's actually doing for the Palestinian people.
This is an interesting and useful reminder. You're saying this would be, if the UN gives diplomatic cover to Israel this evening, later today, at the Security Council, it would be the 47th veto that they have used, you said, since the creation of the UN.
That's correct.
Means in more than that means in 75 years almost.
That's correct, and this included the invasion of southern Lebanon, the occupation of the Golan Heights, and all other resolutions according to international law where Israel has broken international law. But I mean, this really raises the question: what is international law? What is this international liberal order that the U.S. perceives to uphold? There's a big double standard here when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. International communities mobilized quickly. There are atrocities perpetrated and condemned by the international community that Russia has done in Ukraine. But when we focus the shift on Israel, Israel is given a bit of a carte blanche. But I would say that this is really changing. Put aside the US for now, and let's focus on other countries. Like, for example, in Europe, we have the Spaniards, the Belgians, and other European countries who are saying now we are ready to recognize a Palestinian state. We look at the solidarity, the South solidarity with South Africa, Brazil, and other countries in the global South, highlighting the solidarity with Palestine. It really shows how the international community has really moved for the Palestinian issue to be resolved once and for all.
The Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, seemed to be alluding to what you're saying at the end of his last remark, his last answer. He seemed to be suggesting the answer may not be coming from the Security Council. The answer may be coming from this pervasive feeling among the international community, he said, including friends of Israel, this emerging consensus, as he put it, that the war must stop, that the operation in Rafah would be catastrophic, and that nothing can justify the collective punishment of Palestinian people. He seemed to be saying these values, they exist, they are widely shared, not acted upon by the Security Council, but he sees something rising as I listen to him.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at historical parallels, with apartheid South Africa, what really put pressure on apartheid regime in South Africa is this international condemnation and isolation of the South African regime and sanctions and a boycott movement globally. So I think this is really what's going to put pressure on the Israelis. International isolation, a concerted campaign at sanctions, potential sanctions, and trade, impacting trade and weapons transfers to Israel. And finally, the need for a unified Palestinian movement. If you remember, of course, the Palestinians are divided amongst themselves. So the big onus comes to them as well to have a unified movement that can advocate collectively for their demands.
One last thing. The Jordanian foreign minister was asked, how this can be brought to an end, this war, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. He was very honest. He said, look, let's be honest, Jordan can't stop this war. This speaks to something that we've heard so many times from viewers, that what can be done and what can be done specifically in the region and by Arab countries. And his answer by the Jordanian foreign minister is, we can't end this.
Unfortunately, he's speaking truth, because the dynamics in the region highlight that also a number of states have peace treaties and long-term interest with Israel, while they can collectively work together at the Arab League level or the GCC level or at the international level with the UN. There are limitations of this approach, and it really comes down to how much pressure that the US can exert directly on Israel in terms of stopping weapons supplies, stopping funding, and removing the fig leaf we discussed earlier.
Yeah. Adel Abdelghafar, thank you very much for following that live with us in the studio. Thank you.